Good afternoon. Once again, I would like to welcome you to our lecture series, The United States and World Affairs, the Cold War and Beyond. I'm Klaus Laris. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor in History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. As always, I would like to thank Richard Krasno and the generous sponsors behind the Krasno Distinguished Professorship for making possible this lecture series on the United States and World Affairs. I would also like to thank the Department of History and our Center for European Studies for their support of our lecture series. On this occasion today, we are cooperating with the Carolina Asia Center. Thus, great thanks goes to the Carolina Asia Center and its fabulous director, Professor Kevin Hewison. In a few days' time, the lecture today will be available on our YouTube channel. All our previous talks and also the talks in our Ambassadors Forum are available on our YouTube channel. And the address of that channel is www.youtube.com and then Krasno UNC in one word. Today, it is a particular pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Alfred McCoy of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Al McCoy is one of America's leading scholars on the Philippines and indeed on the entire South Asia region and U.S. politics toward Southeast Asia. In a minute, Al McCoy will be introduced properly by Professor Kevin Hewison. Kevin is the director of the Carolina Asia Center and a very distinguished scholar in his own right. Kevin Hewison is the author of more than 117 publications, I believe, on Southeast Asia, on democratization and globalization. In particular, he is a great expert on Thailand. Kevin will now introduce Professor Al McCoy to you. I would just like to add that, as always, there's plenty of time for questions after the lecture today. And please feel free to ask as many difficult and challenging questions as possible, and we really mean that. And then, of course, please don't forget to watch our YouTube channel. And why don't you become a subscriber to our channel? It is totally free of charge. Can you believe it? And we have already got a great number of subscribers, so I think you would like to join as well, please. Kevin, would you introduce Al McCoy, please?
Thanks very much, Scott. Well, thank you for all of you coming. It's great to see a full house. But it would be expected when we've got Al McCoy coming to speak to us. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Al. He's the J.R.W. Smale Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he's also a member of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. After taking his PhD in Southeast Asian History at Yale University in 1977, Al's research has focused on really two topics. The first, the political history of the modern Philippines, and then the covert, what he calls the covert netherworld of illicit drugs, syndicate crime, and state security, an interesting combination. But even before finishing his PhD back in 1977, Al had produced what is now a classic work, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, which came out in 1972, a study of corruption, war, and the CIA's involvement in the opium and heroin trade. It sparked considerable controversy over the CIA's attempt to block its publication. As I said, it's now regarded as a classic study of the global drug trafficking and has been translated into 9 languages, including, interestingly, fairly recently into Thai, and Thailand forms a significant part of that book. And I still use the book, in fact the first edition, for some of my teaching over the last couple of years. Turning to his books on the Philippines, Al has won the Philippine National Book Award for 3 of his books: Philippine Cartoons in 1985, The Anarchy of Families in 1994, and Lives at the Margin in 2001. In addition to that, his book Closer Than Brothers, Manhood at the Philippine Military Academy in 1999 is a remarkable piece of research that has set a standard for contemporary studies on the military in Southeast Asia. In 2001, the Association for Asian Studies awarded Al the Goodman Prize for his deep and enduring impact on Philippine historical studies. His recent book, Policing America's Empire, The United States, the Philippines, and the Rise of the Surveillance State in 2009, won the George Kayan Prize for the Asian Studies Association. His most recent work on covert operations, A Question of Torture, CIA Interrogation from the Cold War to the War on Terror, published in 2006, explores the agency's half-century history of psychological torture. In fact, a film based on part of that book, entitled Taxi to the Dark Side, won the Oscar for Best Documentary Feature in 2008. His latest study of this topic, Torture and Impunity, in 2012, explores the political and cultural dynamics of America's post-9/11 debate over interrogation. In 2012, the Yale Graduate School Alumni Association awarded Al the Wilbur Cross Medal, which is presented annually to a small number of outstanding faculty and alumni, to recognise distinguished achievements in scholarship, teaching, academic administration and public service. Simultaneously, at his own university, they awarded him the Hilldale Award for Arts and Humanities. That's a very distinguished career, and we're very, very happy and honoured to have Al speak to us today.
We've heard a lot of academic lineages, distinguished professors, awards, and the like, but don't be intimidated. We're talking about the future. And as historians talking about the future, we have, I think, professionally, what I call a risible record of performance in getting it right. So we're all equal before the unknown of the future. So we can all sort of relax, play with this speculatively, interpretively, and then feel free to challenge it or interrogate it or overturn it or stretch it. In January of 2010, President Barack Obama delivered a State of the Union address that warned Congress and the country of the serious challenges to America's global power, saying, quote, "China is not waiting to revamp its economy. Germany is not waiting. India is not waiting. These nations aren't playing for second place." And then, with a rhetorical flourish that brought forth a surprising and a rare bipartisan applause from the U.S. Congress, President Obama announced, "Well, I do not accept second place for the United States of America." Echoing those words, a few days later, Vice President Joseph Biden rejected the possibility of U.S. decline, saying, quote, "We will continue to be the most significant and dominant influence in the world as long as our economy is strong." But just last December, the U.S. National Intelligence Council, which is the supreme analytic body of our intelligence community, issued its latest report, taking a diametrically different position by predicting, quote, "By 2030, Asia will have surpassed North America and Europe combined in terms of global power, largely reversing the historic rise of the West since 1750. Why, we might ask, is America's relative economic decline so fast, so precipitous? To answer that unanswerable question, the U.S. National Intelligence Council, an example of what I call America's distinctive imperial epistemology, reduced this multifaceted, complex historical process to just two PowerPoint slides. Okay, here it is, the future in 2 slides, right there. This is slide 1, and this is this is their model, okay? And you can see that, the traditional Ford model forecast, and they've got, the U.S. kind of continue to go up there, but they actually say, no, if you have their new model, what they can see is China going up, and EU going up, and the U.S. going down, and they've got it right here at about 2043. China is more powerful than the United States. And what's the driver? What's making this happen? Okay. This is, I think, the more revealing chart, which they plucked actually from the Brookings Institution. Right? As we can see, historically, Britain increased its share of gross domestic product by just 1% per decade in the era preceding its rise, 1820 to 1870. America raised its share by 2% from 1900 to 1950. And Japan a bit more than 1% from 1950 to 1980. But China is raising its slice of the world pie at an extraordinarily rapid rate of 5% from 2000 to 2020, with India not far behind. With American dominion now being debated at the highest levels, it seems timely to ask first, what kind of empire is this American imperium? And second, will U.S. global hegemony continue deep into the 21st century? To fill the void, the vast void, between the enormity of America's empire and the paucity of its study, 10 years ago, a working group of scholars at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I teach, formed a network of 140 scholars from 4 continents and convened a series of seminars in Madison, Manila, Sydney, and Barcelona, and published since 2 hefty volumes on the rise and decline of U.S. global power. To explore that second question about the possible eclipse of American power, we convened 30 historians at Barcelona in the summer of 2010 to produce a new volume, Endless Empire, that asks very simply, what can the eclipse of 5 European overseas empires tell us about the future of U.S. global power? Through this exercise in comparative imperial history, we went beyond the iron binary of economic and military power, which you could see in the Biden and Obama quotes, to identify 5 factors that might influence the decline of U.S. global power. First factor, waning economic influence, the usual suspect. At the broadest level, the rapid decline of European empires after World War II was driven by their diminished economic strength. Empires are expensive, in fact, very expensive. Without the revenues and armed forces that are almost organic to a conventional, contiguous state, empires must somehow find the extraordinary funds to sustain the enormous expense of their overseas operations, both civil and military. Exhausted by World War II and faced with rising social welfare costs, post-war Britain suffered a crippling post-war economic contraction that denied her the ability to defend the empire. Within just 20 years, 1945 to 1965, the number of subjects under the British flag dropped from 700 million to just 5 million. Indeed, there are undeniable signs of a slow U.S. economic decline. Between 2000 and 2008, America's worldwide patent applications grew by a modest 40% to 232,000 and placed second behind Japan. But China was closing fast at 195,000 applications after a blistering 800% increase. 40% increase for the U.S., 800% increase for China. In 2011, the International Monetary Fund predicted China would become the world's #1 economy in just 5 years, with its share of gross world output surging to 18% by 2016, while America's share would slide to an historic low of 17%, far below its peak of almost 50% back in 1950. After leading the world for most of the 20th century, the U.S. performance in secondary education has stagnated since 1970. In 2009, China stunned American educators when Shanghai students came first in both math and science in a worldwide survey of 15-year-olds, while a comparable U.S. cohort placed at a lowly number 24 and number 31. By 2025, those Shanghai high school students will become China's rising generation of scientists and engineers, just as America's aging cohort is retiring. Compounding this gross decline in its global economic power, America's social welfare costs will rise from 4% of gross domestic product in 2010 to 18% by 2050, confronting Washington with the same choice between domestic welfare and overseas military operations that forced London's global retreat back in the 1950s. Second factor, micro-military misadventures. Not only must an empire secure such scarce resources, but it must expend them wisely, literally picking its battles. During the demoralizing process of decline, imperial armies, once so lethal and so rational during an empire's ascent, can err by plunging into draining, even disastrous micro-military misadventures, psychologically compensatory efforts to salve the stinging loss of power by occupying new territories whose symbolism often exceeds any real economic or strategic value. At midpoint in its 20-year imperial retreat, such crippling psychological pressures led Britain to throw its full military might against Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal, producing a short military victory that became, within days, a humiliating diplomatic defeat, a defeat that marked the end of the British Empire. Similarly, after a searing defeat in Vietnam, Washington reacted by invading tiny Grenada Island with a massive naval armada in 1983, and then plunging into Iraq in 2003, spilling its blood and treasure into desert sands, gaining nothing from expending $1 trillion. As Washington withdraws in defeat from Afghanistan, the invasion of Iran beckons as the graveyard of U.S. global power that might prove a micro-military disaster on the scale of Suez. And if that doesn't happen, others will wait.